Imagine standing on the banks of the Berezina River in late 1812, watching Napoleon's army crumble in the frozen Russian winter. Tens of thousands of men, exhausted, starving, and defeated. But why did this brilliant general, who had conquered almost all of Europe, make the same mistake countless leaders before him had made? Fast forward, and Hitler repeats the same error, marching into the Soviet Union with confidence that borders on delusion. Why do leaders, despite warnings, experience, and history itself, keep making catastrophic mistakes? Is it ambition, fear, or something deeper in the human mind? In this video, we'll take a look into the hidden psychology of power, exploring the mental patterns that drive rulers to repeat history's gravest errors, from emperors to modern presidents, and why understanding these patterns may be humanity's best hope for avoiding the same tragedies in the future. Chapter 1. The Allure and Corruption of Absolute Power. Power is intoxicating. Absolute power is a drug. Lord Acton once wrote, "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." History is full of vivid examples that demonstrate just how profoundly power can warp the human mind, and not always in subtle ways. Take Caligula, the infamous Roman emperor. When he ascended to the throne at the age of 25, he was intelligent, ambitious, and full of potential. Yet within months, his behavior became increasingly erratic. He flaunted his wealth, humiliated senators, and indulged in acts that would shock even the most cynical of observers. One of the most famous stories is that he declared war on the sea, commanding his troops to attack the waves with swords and collect seashells as spoils of victory. Some historians argue that this was madness. Others suggest it was calculated theater to assert dominance. Regardless, the underlying psychological reality was clear. In an environment where no one could check his authority, Caligula's mind began to twist ambition into cruelty and insecurity into spectacle. Power also shapes how leaders perceive reality. Louis XVI of France provides a contrasting example. Unlike Caligula, Louis was not overtly cruel. He genuinely wanted to be a good ruler, yet his absolute authority insulated him from the consequences of inaction. While the country teetered on the edge of economic collapse and revolutionary fervor, Louis remained obsessed with ceremonial splendor, elaborate court rituals, and etiquette at Versailles. He underestimated the growing unrest, ignored systemic problems, and relied on advisors who failed to confront him with harsh truths. In essence, his detachment was a psychological byproduct of power. The more authority he held, the more distant he became from the practical realities facing his people. This pattern is not confined to monarchs of the past. Throughout history, rulers with unchecked power often display similar psychological tendencies: hubris, isolation, detachment, and overconfidence. Napoleon Bonaparte, for example, achieved unprecedented military and political success across Europe. Yet even he was not immune. As emperor, he often ignored dissenting advice, overestimated his control over complex logistical operations, and made decisions based on ambition rather than prudence, ultimately leading to catastrophic campaigns like the invasion of Russia. History repeatedly shows that power can change the way people think and act. Those in high positions, CEOs, dictators, or other leaders often experience a reduction in empathy, an increase in self-confidence, and a narrowing of perception. Leaders may begin to ignore warning signs, dismiss dissenting voices, and prioritize their own ambitions over the well-being of others. Power, in effect, reshapes the mind, making decisions that feel rational to the individual but can have disastrous consequences on a broader scale. Even leaders with the best intentions are not immune. Absolute power can foster a sense of invincibility, causing a person to see the world not as it is, but as they wish it to be. This illusion can distort judgment, magnify arrogance, and blind them to reality. The lesson is both timeless and stark. When humans hold unchecked power, their minds begin to bend toward hubris, fear, and misjudgment. The combination of ambition, isolation, and absolute authority creates fertile ground for repeated errors, cruelty, and, ultimately, the collapse of systems they seek to control. From the Caesars of Rome to modern executives and autocrats, the story is the same. Power transforms minds, often with devastating consequences. Chapter 2. Hubris and the Illusion of Control. Hubris, the ancient Greek concept of overweening pride, has driven leaders to catastrophic decisions for millennia. It is the belief that one is invincible, that the rules of reality somehow bend around personal will. And yet, as history shows, hubris is rarely punished quietly. It escalates, intensifies, and often ends in disaster. Consider Napoleon Bonaparte, whose brilliance reshaped Europe. After years of victories across the continent, he embarked on the invasion of Russia in 1812. Confident in his strategic genius, he ignored warnings from his advisors about the vast distances, harsh winters, and the logistical nightmares of supply lines stretching hundreds of miles. Napoleon believed that his reputation and skill could bend even nature itself to his command. Within weeks, starvation, freezing temperatures, and relentless Russian tactics decimated his army. The once formidable Grande Armée was reduced from over 600,000 men to barely 100,000 survivors. Hubris had blinded him to reality. More than a century later, Adolf Hitler repeated the same catastrophic error. Despite ample historical evidence that invading Russia in winter was suicidal, Napoleon's failure was well documented. Hitler pushed forward with Operation Barbarossa in 1941. Confidence, fueled by ideology and personal mythology, convinced him that his forces could conquer the vast Soviet territories quickly. Like Napoleon, he underestimated the harsh climate, overestimated his troops' capabilities, and dismissed logistical warnings. Millions would die, and the tide of World War II would turn against him. The repetition of these mistakes is not coincidence. It reveals a fundamental psychological pattern. Leaders in positions of immense power often develop an illusion of control, a distorted perception that they can manipulate events at will. This illusion is amplified by several factors: isolation from dissenting voices, constant flattery from subordinates, and the reinforcement of previous successes. Each victory reinforces the belief in invulnerability, even when circumstances change drastically. Hubris does not only manifest in military campaigns, it appears in political decisions, economic ventures, and empire building. Take Richard Nixon and the Watergate scandal. Nixon, confident in his political acumen, believed he could manipulate the system, silence opposition, and evade accountability. Hubris blinded him to the growing risks, the evidence accumulating against him, and the societal backlash that would eventually force his resignation. Even in corporate contexts, hubris drives leaders to overreach. CEOs who achieve rapid success often begin to assume that past strategies will guarantee future victories, ignoring changing markets or warning signs. Kodak's leadership, for instance, dismissed the rise of digital photography despite having early access to the technology, assuming their dominance in film would persist indefinitely. Similarly, Blockbuster ignored disruptive innovation, convinced that their existing model was unassailable. Psychologically, hubris is linked to cognitive biases that are magnified by power. Leaders overestimate their abilities, believe they can predict uncertain outcomes, and dismiss contrary evidence. Power magnifies these tendencies, creating a feedback loop. The more authority a person has, the more insulated they are from consequences, the more confident, and ultimately reckless they become. Yet hubris is rarely isolated from other forces. It often intertwines with ambition, fear, and obsession with legacy. Napoleon, Hitler, and Alexander the Great all displayed this combination: personal ambition fueled by overconfidence, bolstered by echoes of adoration, all driving decisions that ignored history's warnings. Hubris, in this sense, is not just personal pride, it is a systemic psychological trap that emerges when success reinforces delusion. Repeated catastrophic decisions are rarely random. They are the predictable product of human psychology under conditions of extreme power and isolation. Leaders who fail to recognize the limits of their control are doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past, no matter how intelligent, skilled, or visionary they appear. Hubris, then, is both seductive and deadly. It convinces leaders that they can defy history, bend reality, and rewrite the rules of human experience. But history shows that reality is stubborn. Rivers freeze, armies starve, societies rebel, and in the end, the illusion of control shatters, often spectacularly, leaving devastation in its wake. Chapter 3. Fear, Paranoia, and the Spiral of Bad Decisions. Power does not just corrupt through pride, it also corrupts through fear. Leaders, especially those in absolute or near-absolute positions, are constantly aware of threats, rivals, conspiracies, rebellion, or even the unpredictable whims of fate. And fear narrows perception, distorts judgment, and drives decisions that are often more about self-preservation than strategy. Take Joseph Stalin, one of history's most notorious examples of paranoia in power. By the 1930s, Stalin had consolidated near total control over the Soviet Union. Yet he was consumed by fear of betrayal, of rivals, of imagined conspiracies. His response was the Great Purge, a systematic elimination of perceived threats, including loyal generals, administrators, and even childhood friends. Decisions were no longer made for the good of the state. They were driven by the need to survive personally. The result was catastrophic. The Soviet military weakened, the government destabilized, and millions perished, all because fear dictated policy. Similarly, Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China, ruled with a combination of genius and terror. His obsession with securing power led to harsh centralization, the burning of books, and massive forced labor projects, while he achieved remarkable feats, unifying China, standardizing currency and measurements, building roads and the early Great Wall. His paranoia created an environment of extreme repression. Officials feared even speaking truth to him, which ultimately undermined the sustainability of his dynasty. Psychologically, fear creates what researchers call tunnel vision. A leader consumed by threats begins to focus on immediate dangers at the expense of long-term planning. They overreact to minor challenges, ignore strategic opportunities, and often misinterpret the intentions of allies. Fear amplifies hubris in a dangerous combination. A leader may feel invincible in some areas yet excessively vulnerable in others, leading to contradictory and destructive decisions. Fear also interacts with the social environment of power. Leaders isolated from dissenting opinions, either by choice or through loyal subordinates, receive constant affirmation of their worst instincts. Advisors may hesitate to contradict them, worried about repercussions. In this echo chamber, fear escalates unchecked. One misinterpreted action can trigger a cascade of overreactions, creating a spiral of bad decisions that seems rational only to the paranoid mind. Even in modern contexts, fear drives irrational choices. Consider corporate leaders who panic during crises, making hasty mergers, layoffs, or financial gambles to protect personal reputation rather than company health. In politics, autocrats often initiate wars or suppress opposition not out of ideology, but to preempt perceived threats to their power. Across history, fear consistently emerges as a hidden force shaping catastrophic choices. The lesson is clear: fear is a powerful distortion of judgment. When combined with power, isolation, and previous successes, it can lead even the most brilliant individuals to make decisions that are disastrous on both personal and societal levels. Leaders who fail to recognize the influence of fear, who do not cultivate counsel, self-awareness, or emotional regulation, are trapped in a cycle of paranoia, endlessly repeating mistakes and intensifying the consequences of each one. In essence, the psychology of fear explains why history is littered with rulers whose brilliance was undone not by enemies, but by their own minds. The spiral of bad decisions begins not with ambition or hubris alone, but with the subtle, corrosive power of fear itself. Chapter 4: The Echo Chamber Effect. No leader acts entirely alone. Every ruler, president, or CEO relies on a network of advisors, ministers, or subordinates. But the company they keep can be both a support system and a trap. When surrounding voices merely echo a leader's desires, when dissent is punished or silenced, an echo chamber forms, a social environment that amplifies biases and magnifies mistakes. Take Julius Caesar, one of history's most brilliant generals and politicians. Even he, with his extraordinary strategic mind, ignored warnings from the soothsayers and some senators about the dangers of crossing the Rubicon. His advisors often reinforced his ambitions rather than challenging them. In this environment, caution and critical dissent were muted, leaving Caesar vulnerable to both political and military overreach. Similarly, in the 20th century, Neville Chamberlain's policy of appeasement illustrates the dangers of selective counsel. Chamberlain, attempting to prevent war, relied heavily on optimistic advisors who confirmed his beliefs while dismissing dissenting warnings about Hitler's intentions. The result was a catastrophic underestimation of Nazi Germany's aggression, culminating in the outbreak of World War II. The echo chamber made it difficult to see the threat clearly until it was too late. The phenomenon at play is called groupthink, a social psychological dynamic, where the desire for consensus and cohesion overrides independent judgment. In groupthink, individuals suppress doubts, rationalize errors, and even fabricate justifications to maintain harmony. Leaders, especially those with great power, are highly susceptible to this because subordinates often fear challenging them. Across centuries, from Roman emperors to modern executives, groupthink has contributed to repeated historical mistakes, military disasters, financial collapses, and political crises. Power compounds the effect. Leaders who command unquestioned authority often surround themselves with loyalists who are rewarded for agreement and punished for dissent. In such environments, bad ideas are magnified and warnings are filtered out. The Cuban Missile Crisis shows a partial exception, where Kennedy's willingness to listen to advisors prevented catastrophe, but such openness is rare in history. Most leaders, cushioned by loyalty and flattery, develop blind spots that magnify small errors into monumental disasters. Even in modern corporations, echo chambers are dangerous. CEOs insulated by boards of yes-men often misread markets, ignore disruptive innovations, and overcommit to failing strategies. Kodak, Blockbuster, and even Enron illustrate how groupthink can lead entire organizations to catastrophe. The pattern is the same in politics. Isolated governments, unchallenged leaders, and homogeneous advisory circles frequently repeat errors that more diverse counsel might have prevented. Psychologically, echo chambers feed confirmation bias, the tendency to seek and prioritize information that supports pre-existing beliefs. They interact with hubris, paranoia, and ambition to create a perfect storm. The leader becomes convinced of their infallibility, surrounded by voices that reinforce this illusion, and disconnected from reality. The social environment of power is as dangerous as the psychological traps within the leader. Without critical, independent voices, even brilliant leaders can make catastrophic mistakes. Echo chambers do not just distort reality, they amplify it, magnifying the destructive potential of ambition, fear, and hubris. History repeatedly demonstrates that when leaders surround themselves only with affirmation, the consequences are almost always disastrous. Chapter 5: Repetition, Compulsion, and the Human Desire to Leave a Legacy. Beyond hubris, fear, and echo chambers, there is another powerful force shaping catastrophic decisions: the human desire to leave a legacy. Sigmund Freud described a psychological phenomenon called repetition compulsion, the unconscious drive to recreate patterns, often even harmful ones. Leaders, whether consciously or not, often repeat historical mistakes because of ambition, personal mythology, or the pursuit of immortality in memory and history. Take Alexander the Great, for example. His conquest of Persia and campaigns across Asia were unprecedented, yet he did not stop at the known limits of his empire. Pushed by ambition, ego, and a desire to be remembered as greater than all rulers before him, he pressed into India. Advisors warned of overstretched supply lines and hostile terrain, yet Alexander's drive for glory outweighed practical concerns. His army suffered enormous casualties, and some historians argue that continued expansion risked total collapse. The desire to achieve an eternal legacy had clouded judgment, turning brilliance into recklessness. Consider Peter the Great of Russia. His ambition to modernize and expand Russia led to relentless military campaigns and massive internal reforms. Determined to leave a permanent mark on Russian history, Peter imposed European-style modernization, built a new capital at St. Petersburg, and waged prolonged wars against Sweden to gain access to the Baltic. While his reforms transformed Russia into a major European power, the human cost was immense: forced labor, military casualties, and widespread suffering. Peter's drive to create a lasting legacy pushed him to repeat and amplify patterns of conquest and state-building that had destabilized other rulers before him, demonstrating the tension between ambition and practical limits. Another example comes from Cyrus the Great of Persia, whose vision of empire building was both brilliant and relentless. Cyrus sought to unite diverse peoples under the Persian Empire, but he repeatedly pushed the boundaries of his conquests, often stretching supply lines and risking rebellion in newly subjugated regions. His desire to create an enduring empire drove him to mirror and expand upon strategies used by earlier Mesopotamian and Median rulers, highlighting how leaders, even with extraordinary foresight, often replicate historical patterns in pursuit of legacy. Psychologically, repetition compulsion interacts with other tendencies. Hubris convinces leaders of their unique ability to succeed where others failed. Fear of being forgotten or overshadowed drives increasingly risky behavior, and echo chambers reinforce these impulses, offering validation and silencing dissenting voices. The result is a predictable cycle. Leaders pursue actions to cement their legacy, ignore historical lessons, and repeat the very mistakes that history itself has already demonstrated are dangerous. Even outside of warfare, this pattern emerges. Leaders of nations, corporations, or institutions often repeat strategies that have failed elsewhere, believing their approach will succeed because of personal genius or destiny. The desire to create a permanent mark can blind even the most rational minds, turning ambition into repetition, and repetition into disaster. Leaders are human, and humans are driven by patterns that are older than any civilization. The compulsion to leave a legacy is deeply embedded in ambition, ego, and the psychology of power. Combined with hubris, fear, and echo chambers, it ensures that history is never just a collection of facts. It is a mirror of recurring human behavior. Leaders do not simply repeat mistakes because they are foolish. They repeat them because the human mind, under power, is wired to recreate patterns of ambition and glory, often at enormous cost. Chapter 6. Lessons for the Modern Age. If history teaches anything, it's that human nature has iron rules. Rules that do not bend just because eras change or technology advances. Bismarck understood this better than almost any statesman in modern history. He once said, "Fools say they learn by experience. I prefer to profit by others' experience." And that idea, cold, practical, unsentimental, is the perfect lens through which to examine the failures of leaders across centuries. Because when you strip away the drama, the personalities, and the myth-making, what you're left with is a set of patterns as predictable as the seasons. Power isolates, ambition distorts, fear corrodes, and legacy intoxicates. The costumes change: emperors, kings, dictators, CEOs, presidents. But the psychology stays the same. The difference between catastrophe and stability is simply whether a leader can recognize these forces before they consume them. Bismarck's genius was not that he was morally superior or immune to pride. It was that he understood constraints. He cut through the illusions that blinded others. Where Napoleon believed destiny guided him, Bismarck believed in reality, in interests, in limits, in timing. He engineered unification not by fantasy or ego, but by calmly leveraging opportunities and avoiding unnecessary wars. He didn't try to remake the world. He tried to use the world as it was. And that's the critical lesson for the modern age. Great leaders are the ones who accept that they are not gods. They are managers of chaos, not masters of it. Today, nations and corporations alike still fall into the same traps as ancient empires, because the human mind hasn't evolved nearly as fast as our technology. We have nuclear weapons, artificial intelligence, vast digital economies, yet the people controlling them are driven by the same instincts that shaped pharaohs and emperors. Ego still inflates. Paranoia still narrows vision. Flatterers still whisper. And leaders still convince themselves that they, uniquely, will escape the fate of those who came before. Modern politics is full of examples. Leaders who surround themselves with loyalists. CEOs who mistake momentum for genius. Governments that overextend economically or militarily because they refuse to acknowledge limits. The scenery changes, the stakes grow larger, but the psychology remains identical. The tragedy, and the pattern, is that power gives leaders the tools to change the world, but denies them the clarity to see themselves. Bismarck would have said this plainly. Power is dangerous not because of what you can do with it, but because of what it does to your judgment. His entire career was built on resisting illusions, rejecting the comforting myths that seduced other rulers. He avoided colonial overreach, refused to gamble Germany's position, and worked relentlessly to maintain balance. And when Germany abandoned his realism after he left office, it plunged into 2 world wars that proved every warning he ever gave. The modern world, with its globalized systems and nuclear stakes, needs that same ruthless clarity. We cannot afford leaders who chase destiny, legacy, or historical immortality. We need leaders who understand limits, who welcome dissent, who recognize the psychological traps that toppled empires. Because in the end, history is not moved by destiny, it is moved by human beings under pressure. And unless leaders learn to master themselves, they will continue repeating the same catastrophes. The tools of destruction grow more powerful every century, but the human mind stays the same. That's the ultimate ironbound lesson. Power doesn't change. People don't change. But wisdom, if taken seriously, can prevent disaster. A lesson paid for in centuries of blood and ambition, and still waiting to be learned. If you liked this video, especially the glazing of Bismarck at the end, please consider subscribing and ringing the notification bell so that you can notice my videos earlier. Thanks for watching, until next time.